This story is a combination of several events that has happened to my family in our home over the course of many years. I have since moved out of this house, but my parents still reside there. My family's house isn't one of those old, creepy Victorian homes you often hear about in paranormal stories. It's only 20 years old, and everything about it is pretty much normal, except for my bedroom. My room has always had this strange negative energy. We're the only family to ever live there, so it's not like someone died in the house and is haunting my bedroom. It's difficult to explain, but in the corner of my room, I could always feel this dark presence. I obviously couldn't see anything there, but I just always felt that there was this tall, dark, featureless figure standing there, watching me. I never said anything to my family because I didn't want to sound dramatic and bring up something I thought was just in my imagination. As time went on, I would continue to feel this presence, but as I said, I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. I've always had an interest in the paranormal, and I was constantly listening to ghost stories on YouTube and different podcasts. So I thought that my mind was manufacturing stuff to scare me, and there wasn't really anything to worry about. That was until I found out I wasn't the only one to feel this presence. One night while I was staying at a friend's house, my sister slept in my bedroom because she saw a spider crawl across her sheets and she couldn't find where it went. The next day, when I saw my sister, the first thing she said was, "What the hell is in your room?" At first, I didn't know what she was talking about. She explained that the whole night she was trying to sleep, she felt like something was in the room with her. I played dumb and asked her what it was and what it looked like. I wanted to hear her answer first before explaining to her that I had been feeling the same things. She said, "In the corner by the window there was this really tall, like ceiling-height black figure." Upon hearing this, my blood ran cold. All this time, it wasn't just my imagination. I told her that I had been feeling the same thing, and she advised me not to sleep in there anymore. But of course, I didn't listen. Once I knew what I was feeling wasn't just in my head, I talked to my best friend who would occasionally spend the night. I asked her if she ever felt anything strange in my room. She proceeded to tell me that my room always gave her the creeps. I asked her what she felt. She gave me the same answer my sister did. I told my mom about it, but honestly, I didn't care to do anything about it. Sure, it was a bit unsettling, but I thought, if it wasn't hurting me, then what's the problem? About 6 months later, I started having these really terrible nightmares. Some were worse than others, but they were constant. My mom gave me a crucifix and a rosary to put on the shelf above my bed. The nightmare stopped for a short while. However, the strange activity continued. My room is on the second floor, above the living room. Every day, distinct footsteps could be heard walking around my room. Even if there was no one home but myself, I would hear footsteps in my room while I was watching TV downstairs. My parents said that they could hear them too, even when I wasn't home. But it was nothing harmful, so I wasn't too worried. I know that I sound like a psycho, but I was honestly too scared to do anything about it. I thought if I tried to get rid of it, things would just become much worse. With these kind of things, you often hear about people burning sage to expel the dark spirit from their home. But I didn't want to take that route. I was afraid that if the entity felt threatened, it would become more aggressive. I've heard that if cleansings aren't done properly, it only succeeds in enraging the intruding spirit, so I just tried my best to ignore it. The feeling of dread never went away, and the footsteps never stopped. But in some strange way, I learned to live with it. One night, the nightmares returned. I was in a half awake, half asleep state, where your mind knows that you're not fully asleep, but your body is still at rest. In the nightmare, I was sleeping in my bed, and I felt something looking at me. I sat up and opened my eyes, and when I did, there was a man-like creature staring daggers at me. He was standing in the corner of my room. He was bright red and looked how I imagined the devil would. I remember thinking, this isn't a dream. This is real. When it comes to overwhelming fear, I'm neither fight or flight. I just hide under the covers and hope for the best. I eventually fell back asleep and forgot about the whole thing until a few days later, when it finally crossed my mind. I started telling my mother about it, and I only got a few words in before she stopped me and told me that I already told her about the nightmare. I knew that I didn't tell her, because like I said, I had forgotten all about it until just then. After I told her that, she gave it some more thought and recalled that it was my sister who had told her about the nightmare. My mother explained to me what happened in my sister's nightmare, and it turns out that my sister and I had the same exact dream on the same exact night. The only difference was, when she sat up to look at the devilish creature, she looked to her side, and I was sitting in her bed next to her, staring right at her. Upon hearing this was the first time that I felt truly frightened. I moved out of my childhood home not long after this experience, for different reasons though. Obviously, I wouldn't just leave my parents and say, "Bye mom, bye dad, have fun with your demon." Although that doesn't really matter anyway. It wasn't an issue for them, because whatever it was, followed me. After I moved out of my parents' home, they told me that the footsteps had completely stopped. A few things have happened to me at my new home, luckily nothing too terrifying. My husband saw a dark figure pass behind him in the mirror, whispering in my ear, and of course the occasional footsteps. I do still visit my parents often, and even sometimes stay the night. Months after moving out, everything was seemingly normal, no activity. But of course, it was too good to be true, and the entity eventually returned. One night I was visiting my parents, and I decided to stay late. I was in my bed, ready to fall asleep, when my dog, whose name is Lemon, he was very good-natured and rarely ever has the slightest tone of aggression, begins growling and barking at the stuffed animal in my old room. The animal was Stitch, from Lilo and Stitch. It was sitting on top of a pile of other plush toys next to my bed. Lemon would not stop growling at Stitch, so I told her to knock it off, and we went to bed. I thought it was strange, but I just blew it off as usual. The next morning I told my mom how weird Lemon was acting last night. My mom told me that she had a correlating nightmare. In her dream she woke up and saw a large, dark figure, and started shouting the Lord's Prayer at it to scare it off, which worked. She said the figure turned into a black smoke, and once it changed form, the entity went straight down the hall into my room. I now believe that at some point the demon became attached to the doll. Just know that demons can become attached to anyone or anything. It doesn't have to be an old creepy house or even a creepy object. I'm not sure where it came from or why it was haunting me all these years. Perhaps at some point, I unintentionally invited an entity into my home. I like to start off by saying that I've always believed in the paranormal, whether good or bad, but this encounter was unlike anything I've ever experienced in my life. It was the summer of 2013. My nephew, who was around the same age as me, along with my friends Tyler and Ryan, were all hanging out at my house for a sleepover. We started to watch the movie Django Unchained around 12:30 a.m., and if you know that movie, it's a bit long. So after a while, I started to doze off. I finally got up and told everybody that I was too tired to continue the movie, and I was going to crash in the living room. After grabbing a pillow and blanket from my bedroom, I proceeded to turn off all the lights and lay on the couch. Seconds after laying my head on the pillow, I fell into a deep sleep. Suddenly, I woke up. All the lights in the living room were back on, and I asked if anyone was there. I couldn't go back to sleep with all the lights on, so I got up and looked around. What I was confronted with that night still gives me a cold feeling in the pit of my soul. A dark, malevolent presence revealed itself to me. It seemed to have a half-goat, half-human appearance. Now, this is where things get really scary for me. I speak, read, and write Assyrian, which is a modern-day form of the ancient Aramaic language spoken by Jesus and his disciples. This beast before me began speaking to me in ancient Aramaic. I knew enough to recognize the dialect, but I couldn't understand what it was saying to me. The thing then pointed to my room down the hall. I then began making my way towards my bedroom door. It was as if I was in a trance. When I got to my room, I opened the door. At first, I saw nothing but red. Eventually, a vision of my nephew's decapitated corpse appeared to me. His head was resting on my dresser. Both of my friends had been eviscerated and were dangling from the ceiling fan. In my shock, I screamed a curse in ancient Aramaic. To this day, I don't know what it meant or how I was able to speak it, but in the blink of an eye, I woke up in the kitchen. All the lights were off, and I was gripping a sharp Perry knife tightly in my hand. I ran into my bedroom yelling hysterically, waking up all my friends and my mother who was down the hall. After explaining to everyone what I saw, I started shaking and crying like a frightened child. My mother, who is a deeply religious person, blessed the house after she heard my experience. I've had lucid dreams before, but nothing to the extent of what happened that night. This is a true story. It happened in the mid-1970s when I was just a young girl. I was only 11 years old at that time. I lived with my parents, my younger sister, and 3 brothers. I'm not a very good storyteller, but I will tell it the way it happened. When I was just a young girl, my parents got together with my aunt and uncle to play cards, almost every Friday and Saturday night. Now, my sister and I would sleep in the bedroom just off the dining room, so we could see and hear the games as they were being played. Our bedroom had 2 doors, one that opened out into the kitchen, and the other led into the dining room. About my aunt and uncle. My aunt's mother practiced black magic and demon worship. My parents knew about this, but I found out later. One weekend, my aunt and uncle announced that they were expecting a baby. My sister and I were very excited, because we would be allowed to babysit when the adults were playing cards. We began counting down the days. In the meantime, my aunt's mother gave her yarn scraps so that she could sew a blanket for the new baby. This was where the problems began. The baby was finally born. She was a beautiful girl named Samara. I'm changing the names for obvious reasons. Whenever my aunt and uncle were at the house, my sister and I were glued to Samara. We absolutely loved babysitting. One night, after my aunt and uncle left the house, my sister and I were in bed. We had bunk beds, and I slept on the top. We began hearing scratching sounds inside the walls of our bedroom. We didn't think much about it at first, but it got worse. After a while, we started waking up with scratches on our arms and legs. A few times, I was awakened by scratches on my stomach and back, and they always burned like crazy. My parents had an exterminator out because they thought rats were in our room, but the scratching continued and only got worse as time went on, and then the knocking started. The knockings always came in threes as well, and it would happen all over our bedroom walls. About this time, we also noticed that our bedroom was becoming extremely cold. This was in the summer, and we had no AC in our room, so it was a bit odd that it would be so cold. It would get to the point where we could see our breath. About the time that the knocking started, we would also hear whispering in our room, along with another noise that I can only describe as raspy growling. It was around this time that my aunt started to exhibit odd behavior. She would randomly growl and make strange noises. She glared at my uncle and the baby. She was no longer the friendly and loving person we've always known. My aunt and I had been very close before, but she seemed to distance herself and was always rude and nasty. One night, I woke up to the sound of voices coming from the dining room, and I could see that the dining room light was on. Our bedroom door was slightly ajar. I got out of bed to see who was out there, but as soon as I opened the door all the way, I saw that all the lights were off, and there was no one there. On another night, I woke up and went to the kitchen to grab a drink of water when I heard whispering voices coming from the living room. There were no lights on, and it was pitch dark. When I turned the kitchen light on, the voices suddenly stopped, and there was no one there. This happened almost every night, and whenever I would check things out, there would always be no one there. One night, everyone woke up in the house to the sound of pounding at our front door. When my father opened the door, my uncle fell into his arms and was crying hysterically. The only thing we could make out was him saying, "She stabbed her! She stabbed her!" When my uncle finally calmed down, he told my parents that my aunt had stabbed the baby 6 times in the back. He said it took 6 police officers, 4 neighbors, and my uncle to subdue her. He claimed that she was throwing around the officers like rag dolls. My aunt is a very small woman, and under normal circumstances, she wouldn't have been able to lift a fully grown man, let alone throw him across the room. My aunt would eventually be admitted to a mental hospital. The baby was alive, although no one understood how. She was in intensive care for 2 months, but thankfully made a full recovery. The night after my aunt had gone insane, I woke up to a freezing cold bedroom. It was colder than it ever had been before. I heard whispering in our room. It was coming from the adjacent dining room. The bedroom door was open, and as I looked up, there was this dark mist. There was a man's face in the mist. He had black hair, a black mustache, and a goatee. His eyes were pure black, and he stared at me with the creepiest grin on his face. I was so terrified that I started screaming. My screaming woke up my sister, and she began screaming as well. This woke up the entire house. My parents and older brother ran into the room, and as soon as the light came on, the creepy face disappeared. My father grabbed me off the bed and carried me into the living room as my mother took my sister. When we were finally calm enough, I told my parents about the mist and about the creepy face. The next day, my mother and father started trying to figure out what had entered our home just before these weird things started happening. We searched the house, and the only thing new that had come into our house just before these weird things started to occur was the baby blanket that my aunt had made from the yarn that was given to her by her mother. My mother called my uncle, and he and my older brother decided to take the blanket out and burn it. They put the blanket in the trunk of my mother's car and drove out to the river. As they drove, the trunk of the car flew open. My brother got out and closed it. However, they didn't get far. The brakes in the car went out. My mother had just gotten new brakes put on the week before. So after the brakes went, they walked over to the bridge over the river, and my brother and uncle took the blanket, doused it with gasoline, lit it, and threw it off the bridge. As the blanket fell, my brother and uncle heard screaming. It wasn't just one voice screaming, but many. After the blanket was gone, our house started to feel normal again. It was warm and welcoming. There was no more whispering or knocking on the walls. We had no more scratches on our bodies. Unfortunately for my aunt, after she got out of the hospital, she became more distant, and my mother no longer associated with anyone who was involved with black magic or demon worship. My aunt and uncle divorced shortly after she was released from the hospital, and the craziest part of all is that my aunt was awarded custody of the baby who she had stabbed when she was only 6 months old. I have not had any contact with my aunt or Samara in many years, but I truly hope all is well with them.
There's always a reason to be afraid.